If your writing isn't working the way you want it to, it could be because you're using too many symbols instead of signals. There are two different ways to communicate meaning to the reader. There are two different ways to communicate meaning to the reader. We can give them a symbol, which directly states what we're trying to convey, or we can use a signal, which allows the reader to infer what we're trying to convey. If you're driving a car, a symbol that you need to stop is something like a red light. A signal you need to stop is a pedestrian running to the edge of the sidewalk, not looking both ways, and then crossing in front of you. A lot of the best writing uses signals. When you make the reader feel something, when you evoke emotion, when they connect the dots about some plot element, that's communicated using a signal. People love to read signals. Symbols, while they convey information, are not as engaging. So let's talk about the difference between signals and symbols and how they can help or hurt your writing. This is something that I noticed a while ago, and I came up with this. Can you stop, please? This is something that I noticed a while ago, and I came up with this symbol signal terminology to describe it. Like most things in writing, it exists on a spectrum. Something can be really, really like a symbol, or really, really like a signal, or somewhere in between, and I'll have lots of examples throughout this video. This spectrum roughly correlates to the abstract, concrete, or the show and tell spectrum, but there are some differences, and the way to approach this is maybe a little bit different. One theme that we'll see throughout this is that signals tend to happen across multiple parts of a story or multiple parts of a scene, whereas symbols are something that happens moment to moment and tend to be much more self-contained. Let's start by talking about symbols. Now, we actually use a ton of symbols in writing, and any great novel is going to have a lot of symbols within it. When you boil it right down, all of language and words and definitions and things are just different symbols with meaning attached to them. Using symbols is not necessarily a problem. The problem comes in when we use symbols in places where a signal would be better. A symbol is usually easily defined. It adds context to a passage rather than using the existing context or being modified by existing context, which we'll talk about later on. And symbols usually require some pre-existing knowledge external to the actual work itself in order to understand what they mean. I'll give you some examples to explain this. On the very far end of the spectrum here towards symbol, we have things like punctuation and formatting. Arguably, everything that shows up in a style guide is a symbol. The reason style guides exist is to give us meaning to attach to different symbols. A question mark is a very strong symbol. It has an easily defined purpose. It creates context because it turns the preceding sentence into a question, and there is sort of a logical reasoning that's needed to understand a question mark. The reader has to know that a question mark indicates an interrogative. They have to engage logic to get the meaning of this symbol. Another example is something like dialogue formatting. In most style guides, either single quotes or double quotes are used to indicate dialogue. When you put quotes around text, it usually indicates that it's dialogue, along with things like moving the dialogue to a new line and also the presence of a dialogue tag. These are symbols that create context that something is dialogue. These kinds of symbols are totally fine and actually make it easier to read your novel. Again, the problem with symbols only comes in when we start to use symbols in places where a signal would be better. If we have a character who is angry, there are basically two broad ways that this can be conveyed to the reader. I can use the body language of the character, have them ball their fists or furrow their brows. I can do it through dialogue, have them lash out at another character. I can do it through their actions, having them smash a chair against a wall or something like that. I could even use something like character thoughts, though conveying a lot of emotions through character thoughts can be a little bit iffy. All of these things use signals to convey to the reader that the character is angry. The reader interprets this information and comes to a conclusion about it. These signals, as Most signals also rely on existing context rather than necessarily adding context to the story. In the case of an angry character lashing out, if we have an established context about why they're becoming angry, like their favorite football team just lost the tournament or whatever, then that context aids in the interpretation of the signal. Context? An event happens in the story. We know from the existing context around that event, everything that we've read up to this point, that this will make the character angry, and this signal is confirmed by the actions described in the text. Now, another way that we could convey that a character is angry is we could use a symbol. A symbol in this case would be something like an adverb. We might say that a character said something angrily, or sat down angrily, or ate their spaghetti angrily. All of those would use an adverb. Adverbs are basically at the halfway point between symbols and signals. Adverbs add context. That's the primary reason that people use them. If you take the angrily away from the he said angrily, you may have no way to convey the anger without that adverb. There's no context for what he's saying. Adverbs primarily add context. Adverbs and other symbols require the reader to leave the novel and go searching in their brain dictionary for what the thing means. When you add an adverb like angrily, the reader is going to stop reading for 1 nanosecond and go into their mind to look up the definition of what that says. Whereas signals create an emotional reaction, and part of that emotional reaction comes from all of the context that affects the signal. Symbols are very self-contained. Remove an adverb and you've removed the symbol. Signals can be a bit more amorphous, especially when you get to ones with bigger emotional impacts. If you have something like a character death that is meant to deeply affect the reader because it's a character they like, then this death is going to be a signal that is going to rely on a lot of context. You might have 3/4 of a novel's worth of context built up that goes into creating the reaction to that character death. The signal only lands because of the relationship the reader has developed with the character. This is why it's harder to pull out a signal from a novel, and why I haven't written any examples of signals down on my little graph here. Because in cases like this, every single scene that the character is in is arguably part of the signal. A good sign that you are using too many symbols in your novel is if a lot of your story beats aren't interwoven with earlier parts of the story. If there's nothing that's being built up, you're just sticking in these symbols and telling the reader, you should feel sad here, or you should be angry about this. These characters are now in love. You're just putting these things all over the story. You're not building anything up. You're not creating those emotional reactions and signaling things to the reader. It's like on those shows where they have like a live studio audience and they have the signs that say applaud, or the signs that say laugh, or the signs that say gasp, things like that. That's basically what you're doing in your novel. That's much less satisfying writing. People love to read signals because they're emotionally engaging. You're triggering emotion within the reader, which feels better than just seeing a bunch of symbols that tell them what they should feel. This is where the symbol-signal dynamic really plays out. Symbols are like lights that you turn on. Signals are events that play out and create meaning over time. They let the reader participate in the story. A red light tells you to stop. Someone running towards the edge of the sidewalk, not slowing down and not looking both ways up the street, is a signal that you need to stop. You'll notice that one of those is a story and the other one isn't. Signals are fundamentally what makes stories. Symbols are just symbols. So given that stories are fundamentally about stringing signals together, which one should your story be made up of? That last sentence had a question mark on the end of it. Speaking of end of it, this is the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed this little diatribe. If you've got any thoughts about this, please share them in the comments down below. If you want to see more stuff like this, you can check out all my other videos and subscribe to my channel. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.